It's probably the biggest question we all ask ourselves at some point. What happens when we die? Is that it? Or is it just the beginning of something else? Well, today we're going to unpack the biblical perspective on this, breaking it all down into a clear step by step journey, from the very last breath to what the Bible calls the final resurrection. So let's get into it. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the moments right after death. Then, we'll dive into this ancient concept called Sheol. After that, we'll see how Christ's death and resurrection was a total game changer. That leads us to the new path that opened up. And finally, we'll look ahead to the ultimate future, the final resurrection. Okay, so let's start right at that moment. According to the biblical account, death isn't just the end. It's not a final stop. It's actually described more like a transition, the start of a whole new phase of existence. Yeah, it doesn't get more direct than that, does it? The Bible frames the answer by making a really fundamental distinction between two different parts of who we are. And here's the key distinction right here. The physical body, our earthly shell, it returns to the earth where it came from. But the soul, or the spirit, that essential part of you, the real you, it keeps going. Its journey isn't over. And this idea is anchored way back in Genesis. It sets the stage for everything else. The physical part is temporary, but the soul's story, well, it has another chapter. And that's where things get really fascinating, especially when we look at the world before Christ. See, before Jesus, the destination for all souls, whether they were righteous or unrighteous, was understood very differently. It wasn't exactly heaven or hell in the way we usually picture them. This temporary place was known as Sheol in the Old Testament or Hades in the New Testament. And the key thing to remember here is that this was a universal destination. It was a conscious waiting place for everyone who died. But it wasn't the same experience for everyone there. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Based on the story of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke, this realm, Sheol, had two very distinct sides. For the righteous, there was a place of comfort and peace called Abraham's bosom. But for the unrighteous, there was a place of suffering and separation. And apparently, there was a great chasm fixed between them, so no one could cross from one side to the other. This whole system, though, it was about to be completely upended. And that brings us to the absolute turning point in this whole story, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This was the one event that fundamentally changed the destiny of the human soul, according to the Bible. When Jesus said these words on the cross, he was declaring that the job was done. The mission to provide salvation and defeat sin and death itself was complete. But his journey wasn't over yet. So this timeline really lays out that critical sequence of events. After the crucifixion, his spirit went to Hades, the realm of the dead. But he didn't go there to suffer, he went to proclaim victory. And that was followed by the resurrection, which was the ultimate proof that he had conquered death. And this detail is super important. The preaching it talks about here wasn't an offer of a second chance. It's understood as a declaration of triumph. He was essentially announcing to the spirits there that he had won, and the old system of sin and death was now broken. So, okay, what did this victory actually mean for people who died after him? Well, it opened up a brand new direct path for anyone who put their faith in him. And this right here shows you the before and after in a nutshell. Before Christ, the righteous waited in comfort in Abraham's bosom. But after Christ's resurrection, believers are described as going immediately into paradise, into the very presence of God. That waiting room was no longer the final stop for them. And this promise from Jesus to the thief on the cross, well, it's seen as the ultimate proof of this new reality. Not someday, not after a while, but today. It signifies an immediate, direct journey to paradise for a believer. Right, so you might be wondering, what about those who aren't saved? Well, the point is that while the path for the righteous changed dramatically, the state for the unrighteous did not. They continue in that state of separation in Hades, waiting for the final judgment at the end of time. All right, this brings us to what the Bible describes as the final act. Everything we've talked about so far, the intermediate states in paradise or Hades, it's all still temporary. There is one last, ultimate event planned for all of humanity. That's right, a physical resurrection for every single person, no matter who they were or what they believed. This isn't just about the soul floating around forever. It's about the soul being reunited with a new resurrected body. And this quote from the Gospel of John really drives that point home. It's universal. It says all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out, some to a resurrection of life and others to a resurrection of judgment. So you can basically break this whole final event down into three main steps. First, there's the call, where every soul hears the voice of Christ. Second, the resurrection itself, for everyone. And third, the final judgment, where the permanent, eternal destiny for every single person is decided once and for all. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of the big takeaways here. First, death isn't seen as the end, but a transition into a conscious state of being. Second, Christ's resurrection was a game changer that created a direct path to paradise for believers. And finally, all these states are just an intermediate phase before one final universal resurrection and judgment for every person who has ever lived. And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? This biblical framework lays out a very specific destination, a very clear endpoint for humanity. So the question for us is, how does believing in a particular endpoint like that shape the way a person lives the journey, right here and right now?